Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Charlotte Parkin and I serve as the Director for Research and Partnerships at the London Global Gateway, Notre Dame's London Global Gateway. And it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you to our third and final London Research Seminar for Spring 2022. For those who are new to Notre Dame, we are a large Catholic research university which highly values undergraduate teaching, and we are global in scope. We have many gateways and centres throughout the world, the largest of which is in our London Global Gateway, who is hosting the seminar today. The seminars are a wonderful opportunity for us to showcase the rich variety of research talent we have working at the Gateway and beyond. And tonight we are collaborating with our good friends at the Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham University for this seminar, as the topics touch upon research that is of significant interest to both of us and have links to collaborative initiatives that are currently taking place. Now, before we get underway, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping for tech. You are welcome to keep your videos on throughout the seminar, and we encourage you to use the chat window, which is at the bottom of your screen, to submit questions. Later in the programme, we will be having a Q&A segment with both our speakers, and we will address as many questions as possible. So throughout the session, please just put your questions in, no matter when it's going on, into that chat window as we spend our time together. Now, without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to tonight's first speaker, Helen Kilburn. Helen is a historian of early modern Atlantic with special interest in the activities of English Catholics in the colonial Americas, especially in Maryland. Her research and teaching focuses on the complexity of relationships that arose between settler colonists, free and enslaved Indigenous Americans, and Black people, and especially the importance of religious belief to those relationships. Helen will be actually heading up to Durham University later on this summer to use the libraries and the archives up there to further her research. And in tonight's seminar, Dr. Helen Kilburn will explain how 17th-century Catholics in Maryland used the empire to safeguard wealth from English anti-Catholic penal codes. So it's going to be a fascinating talk. And now I'm going to hand over to Helen.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully everyone is able to see that easily enough. So first of all, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining. And I'd also just like to extend my thanks to Charlotte, Idil, Tom, Joe, and the whole team who's got us to this point, and also to my co-presenter Elizabeth as well for joining. So the title of my paper today is admittedly a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it reflects Catholic endeavours to use colonisation to protect their wealth, and also in response to Protestant distrust of their regency, and that is with the intention of defending their English subjecthood through a commitment to English empire. So today I'm going to be focusing on new research conducted to convert my PhD thesis into a monograph. So I'll say then from the outset, there are some aspects of this research which are works in progress, and not all of my conclusions are completely formed yet. So for this reason, I'm gladly take and welcome comments and questions on how the research is starting to take shape. That being said, there are findings from the thesis which I am confident about. In England, anti-Catholic penal codes were not only a system of legal and financial censure. As common law treasons, they transformed the way that the English state defined its own citizens, or it would have been subjects at that point, by codifying that loyalty to the papacy was tantamount to allegiance to a foreign aggressor. And as a consequence, English Catholics in the popular imagination in culture were made foreign by their own governments, and the means of identifying them was legislated to diffuse into even the most intimate spaces, such as the censor of administration of Catholic sacraments at birth, marriage, and death. To financially penalise Catholics, English governments after the Reformation operated a system called sequestration. And under this system, the estates of the individual charged with regency was sequestered or confiscated. And Catholics of all financial means were expected to compound for their regency, so essentially pay a fine. Recusants were then granted protection from future prosecution if they paid their compounding fee, and if they agreed to pay higher rents on the seized estates, which were then leased back to them for a period of 41 years at a time. So consequently, the English government could rely on a steady stream of income from Catholic sequestered estates. Alexander Shepherd has argued that in early modern England, subjects quote unquote accounted for themselves to establish their quote unquote worth in society through a pecuniary code that was culturally negotiated and often linked to life cycle rights. And I'll expand on this later in the paper. In the thesis, I argued that when Alexander Shepherd's framework of worth is applied to sequestration, it becomes clear the English Catholics suffered damage to their worth in society and consequently their ability to obtain credit, develop trades, or even just to make advantageous marriages outside of their own confessional community. So for this reason, the Lord Baltimore was incentivized to establish a colony which removed these penalties to ensure that Catholics could prosper. The idea was set forth first in the Conditions of Plantation he published in 1632, but it was only codified in the colony with the Act of Toleration in 1649. Importantly, when Protestant resentment towards Catholic success was articulated in documents returned to government in London, mostly surrounding the 5 rebellions I've listed here, all of those documents presented that the success of English Catholics in Maryland was viewed as extra legal, because most Protestants expected that even that in an English colony, English Catholics would be subject to English law, and that included the anti-Catholic penal codes. So as I revised the book, I want to delve more deeply into the legal frameworks used to establish and operate English colonies and the debates had by jurors about which legal schemas, be that Roman law, canon law, civil law, or common law, should apply. And if it should apply, where and under which conditions it should. And I also want to better understand how English Catholics use their kin networks to sow enough confusion about property ownership amongst recusants and their conforming kin, kin who are members of the Church of England, to protect against financial ruin. A big part of that is trying to also think about how casuistry was at play here. So for fear of poverty, sort of gaming the system and conforming in certain areas at certain times. Then finally, I'm interested in whether these kin networks, particularly family members or kin members who did conform, gave English Catholics access to legal advice in England when they had been barred from office or entering the Inns of Court. Although I am just sort of also looking into an area of research that looks at the Inns of Court in Dublin, where there wasn't a bar on Catholics entering into at the Dublin Inns, but it was still an English common law system. So they may well have gained knowledge of the legal system that way. So before I start on the legal case that's sort of dominating my interest at the moment, I want to briefly give some context to it, and that is Ingle's rebellion. So in 1645, Maryland was invaded by a band of privateers who, with the support of a number of Protestant settlers, overthrew the Catholic proprietary government of Lord Baltimore and subsequently plundered many Catholic estates, including the Jesuits' plantation of St. Inigo's. The rebellion was later described as the plundering time by Catholic Marylanders and was led by a staunch Protestant and parliamentarian Richard Ingle, who was the captain of a ship of, and I kid you not, it was called the Reformation. So in 1646, Governor Leonard Calvert, brother to the Lord Baltimore Cecil Calvert, returned with a force of exiled Marylanders and some Virginia mercenaries and restored the proprietary government. Now, Lord Baltimore was a royalist, and Ingle attempted to justify his efforts with the authority of a parliamentary letter of marque, which was issued to him on the 1st of December 1643 for the purpose of seizing vessels trading to ports hostile to Parliament. But Ingle's motivations to plunder Maryland were also a combination of vengeance for his arrest in the colony a couple of years earlier, personal anti-Catholicism, and also an opportunistic attempt to exploit pre-existing religious conflicts in the colony to increase his wealth through seizure of goods. So in order to achieve that, Ingle captured and returned to England prominent Catholic planters Giles Brent, John Luger, who was the secretary of the colony, Cuthbert Fenwick, and the Jesuits Thomas Copley and Andrew White. So I'm going to focus on a case that was pursued in the High Court of Admiralty in June to July 1645, where, having successfully escaped the noose for the accusation of having violated the Act against Jesuits and Seminaries in 1585, the Jesuit Thomas Copley pursued goods plundered by Captain Richard Ingle in Maryland. And Copley did so alongside lay Catholic siblings Giles Brent and his sister Margaret Brent. So in my article here, if you want to read up a little bit more about it, I examined Copley's case, but from the perspective of looking at priests and property in law in England and the colonies. But what I'm going to be focusing on in the paper today is actually the Brent's side of this story. So when writing the article on Copley, I was struck by these depositions in the Copley and Brent versus Reformation case, and specifically that all of the deponents described their worth here as accounted, their gentility and political allegiances in the same way, almost verbatim. None of them made any reference to their confessional identity. And so I was confident that they were coached by a lawyer, but I had no proof of this because none of the documents recorded any legal representation. And I should also thank Tom O'Connor here too, because at the MBIT conference in 2016, he asked about this idea of legal representation. So it kind of gave me the confidence that I wasn't sort of overestimating the importance of this similarity. So, like I say, couldn't let sleeping dogs lie. And so I kept digging. And what I came across was an article published at the turn of the 20th century by W.B. Chilton. And he wrote a genealogy of the Brent family in Virginia. And within it, he describes a judgment passed by Sir Nathaniel Brent and Dr. Eilert in the High Court of Admiralty, which found against Richard Ingle in favour of the owners of a Dutch ship called the Looking Glass. Now, Chilton had only transcribed the deposition against the Reformation made by Father Thomas Copley, Giles and Margaret Brent, and I managed to track down the original manuscript of that in the High Court of Admiralty records in the National Archives. But this judgment was not amongst those documents. So I kept looking into Nathaniel Brent, and I learned that during the English Civil War, he had advised Parliament on Admiralty matters and treaties, and served as a High Court of Admiralty judge. So after searching for him in the state papers, assuming the judgment might have been parcelled with his advisory notes, I found this judgment that Chilton refers to in 1904. Now, the Parliamentary and High Admiralty records tell us that Sir Nathaniel Brent and I've gone too fast there. Parliamentary and High Court of Admiralty records tell us that Sir Nathaniel Brent and Dr. Richard Eilert disputed that Maryland was in rebellion against King and Parliament, which in quotes. And so Ingle's seizure of the Looking Glass was therefore illegitimate. Now, the Looking Glass belonged to a number of Rotterdam merchants, including a Mr. Henry Books, who had also been captured by Ingle, but who had died en route to London. In 1643, Parliament claimed that they had not rejected monarchy outright, but rather were fighting to redress the balance of power between King and Parliament. So they haven't sort of got to the point of thinking about regicide by this point. And that also explains why this particular phrase was used. The Looking Glass judgment was therefore vital to the Catholics' defence that they were not in rebellion, so they could recover goods stolen by Ingle. Now, Ingle levied two accusations at Marylanders. The first was that they were royalists in opposition to Parliament on the grounds that the Lord Baltimore had, on the 26th of January, 1643, received a commission from Charles I to seize in Virginia ships trading with London, since that city was in rebellion. However, the Lord Baltimore had insisted that the commission did not extend to Maryland. This declaration was strengthened by the Maryland Assembly's vote to trade freely with all ships who entered her ports in the same year. Ingle also claimed that Catholics in Maryland were not only rebels, but inherent traitors because of their commitment to the Roman Catholic faith, and specifically loyalty to the Pope. And this was a threat that he also collapsed with the threat of racial austerity when he claimed that Catholics in Maryland had conspired with indigenous Americans at Port Tobacco to, quote, cut the throats of Protestants. Ingle lost in every case he fought, and even priests like Andrew White and Thomas Copley escaped execution, let alone financial penalty. So in the article they published in 2019, I made the argument that Thomas Copley likely triumphed over Richard Ingle because the Maryland Assembly had not directly adopted penal legislation from England. that would have made Catholic missionary work in the colony an indictable common law treason under the Act against Jesuits and seminarists. At the same time, by declaring that Maryland was a free trade colony, the Assembly established the protection of the inhabitants' goods from sequestration or forfeiture by both the Crown and Parliament. If this was the case, this means that Sir Nathaniel Brent and Dr. Robert Eilert assessed the merits of Ingle's case based on the application of positive law rather than on anti-Catholic prejudice. Now, I'm hoping that the judgment on the looking glass will confirm this theory. Importantly, by analysing the document, I hope to learn exactly which legal principles were employed in Sir Nathaniel Brent's contribution to the development of colonial jurisprudence in the English Atlantic, as he's continuing to advise Parliament at this time. However, I will say that this document is 278 pages long. It's in Latin and as well as English, and it's also in a difficult hand. And as you can see from this particular page, some of the pages are in quite poor shape. So I've got about 80 pages transcribed so far and only really like a gist translation. So I am going to return to the idea of positive law in the conclusion, but I can't make firm or say firmly that this theory that I have is going to play out. So what I am going to focus on for the rest of the paper is the relationship between the Brents in Maryland and Sir Nathaniel Brent, the High Court of Admiralty judge. So the various branches of the Brent family all centre on the borders of 3 counties in the southwest of England: Gloucestershire, Warwickshire and Oxfordshire. Sir Nathaniel Brent was one of 12 children born to Anchor Brent of Little Wolford at the bottom of the map in Warwickshire, and Elizabeth, daughter of John Pratt of Chipping Camden in Gloucestershire, which are roughly about 10 miles apart. And the earliest record for Anchor Brent that I've been able to find so far documents his ownership of about 1/4 of land in the parish and manor of Salden in Oxfordshire, about 20 miles away from Little Wolford. After the English Reformation, Salden had a strong reticent presence, and a number of the individuals listed here were indicted for recency, and they were strong supporters of the English mission and exiled religious community, especially the Weedons and Kilbys, who supported, I think it was Kilby, for example, supported the Benedictine nuns in Dunkirk. Other names, such as Sir Thomas Arundel, all are well known in early modern English Catholic studies as one of the grandees of Regency. So I intend to research further into the impact of confessional identity in this particular community, and especially Anchor and Sir Nathaniel Brent's interactions with the likes of, say, Sir John Arundel of Lenham, who would have been contemporary to Nathaniel, as well as the Weedons and Kilbys. But I'm also curious to learn more about this Fulk Berchier, who I suspect may have been a patron of the Maryland Brents. And I'm pursuing that line of inquiry because Fulk Berchier may have been the namesake of Fulk Brent. It's quite an unusual name. So he's highlighted here in the black box. And Fulk Brent was the younger brother of Giles Brent, and he was also a migrant to Maryland. Now, this family tree is the Brent family tree of the Reticent line, which is taken from Catherine Keat Rowan's English Catholic Nuns in Exile. Both the Maryland branch and the English branch contributed a large number of men and women to religious life. And in Maryland, they married other wealthy planters, mostly Catholics, across Virginia and Maryland. So, for example, we see here highlighted in the center orange box, Baker Brooke, who was one of the wealthiest planters in Maryland and who married Anne Calvert, the daughter of Leonard Calvert, and she was potentially the Jesuit child. I can't find my marriage record, but Leonard Calvert had a relationship with Anne Brent, who was the sister of Margaret Giles and Fulk Brent, and Anne Calvert was their daughter. So I'm yet to determine if there's any relation between Baker Brooke and Henry Brooke, the Rotterdam merchant and part owner of the Looking Glass, who died as a captive Richard Ingle en route to England, but I am working on that. But it's Giles, Margaret and Fulk's great-grandfather, William Brent, who I want to draw attention to at this point. He's highlighted in the blue box. And William Brent is described as Lord of Admington and Lark Stoke in Gloucestershire, and he died only 2 years after his son Richard Brent, who is the only Richard not highlighted here, so the one in the middle. So as late as the 17th century antiquarian of Oxford University and a good critic of Sir Nathaniel Brent tells us, William Brent was the younger brother of Richard Brent, who was Sir Nathaniel's grandfather. This made William's son Richard the cousin of Sir Nathaniel Brent, and therefore Nathaniel Brent was the first cousin once removed of Giles and Margaret Brent. So this means that when Ingle was brought to court at the High Court of Admiralty by Thomas Copley and the Brents, there was in a suit intended by Copley and the Brents to recover goods that Ingle had stolen. Ingle had the deep misfortune of being judged by a relative of the plaintiff. So it's also worth noting that Larkstoke and Admington is just 9 miles north of Little Wolford, and the home of Anchor's which was the home of Anchor and Sir Nathaniel Brent, which is also about 6 miles east of Chipping Campden. All of these Brent family members were therefore living in very close proximity to one another, and so potentially remained in close contact with one another. And certainly Andrew Hegarty has suggested that the relationship between the cousins was close enough that the Sir Nathaniel Brent's confessional loyalty was actually called into question on account of his cousin's regency. So returning to the activities of Richard Ingle and the court case presented before Sir Nathaniel Brent, other documents found in the English archives may begin to further reveal just how interconnected were recusant families in Maryland and the southwest of England. Again, we see the name Brooke here appearing in records related to the Brent family in this sequestration case heard in County Gloucestershire in 1651. But again, I'm still figuring out these Brooke connections and whether these Brookes are related to the Maryland Brookes or the Brookes of Rotterdam. But again, I'm still working on that. In the sequestration case, with the widow of Robert Lord Brooke claimed that she was harmed financially since, as a conforming Protestant, she was indirectly affected by the sequestration of Richard Brent, who was then deceased, but his sequestration remained unresolved by his heirs, whom she'd leased land from, specifically from Fulk Brent, who at this point had returned to England from Maryland, presumably to manage these affairs at home. Now, potentially, Catherine Brooke's occupancy of the land was intended to secure it from sequestration, and this is certainly what Alex Gregory's recent book, Catholics During the English Revolution, has found, that influential Protestant allies often supported Catholics who attempted to have their sequestrations discharged. But I want to draw attention to the sums of money that were levied as a part of this sequestration process. So in 1652, Catherine states that £45 was levied by the sequestration officer, Giles Hancock. Now, sequestration attacked an individual's worth by undermining their creditworthiness in society. And Alexandra Shepherd has revealed that in early modern England, obtaining credit was simultaneously an economic transaction and a communal exercise of evaluating an individual's worth in social, political, and ideological terms. In short, the more visible wealth that you had or real estate, the more creditworthy you were, the more you ascended the social classes. But when you were sequestered, all of that financial wealth was challenged, and your right to hold it, and therefore your regency was also deeply tied to your social status. Importantly, the figures that are most often used in depositions that are assessing worth are seen here within this sequestration case. So Hancock's decision to levy a compound fine of £45 was therefore not arbitrary, but an attack on the worth of the recusant Richard Brent and his descendants, to a sum more than twice that cited as a measure of means and eligibility to vote at the time. So when Richard Ingle attacked Maryland, he did so having first captured the Brent family account books, from which he systematically plundered the chattel wealth of Catholics across the colony before raising their real estate. His decision to do so was not simply marauding, it was a direct attack on recusant worth. And in many ways, it's not unsurprising that Ingle believed he would be able to retain his plunder, armed as he was with the letter of marque and the precedent of the challenge to recusant worth presented by sequestration, never mind the support of local disgruntled Protestants in Maryland. If Sir Nathaniel Brent was inclined to help his cousins recover their wealth, then Justice Copley escaped prosecution under the Act of Jesuit Seminaris because the Maryland Assembly had not adopted that law directly. It is plausible that Nathaniel Brent argued that equally legislation that authorised the sequestration of estates on the grounds of regency had not been adopted by the Maryland Assembly, and so the confiscation of property for that reason was as invalid as its confiscation on the grounds that Maryland was in rebellion against King and Parliament. So again, I need to test this theory by translating this judgment, but certainly the swift passage of the Act of Toleration 1649 to protect freedom of conscience kind of leans in towards or to support that theory, because once this act was passed, it meant that any it would have to be revoked for anti-Catholic penal codes to be applied in Maryland, and we see the wealth and status of Catholics explode after this point. So just wrapping up now, positive law essentially performs one of four functions. It codifies citizen and state rights and the protection of those rights from other citizens or states, and it obliges a state or citizen to do something or prevent them from doing something. It's perhaps no surprise then that shortly after the Protestant Revolution, 1649 Act of Toleration was revoked, which removed Catholic right to worship and protection from discrimination or persecution on the grounds of religion. And at the same time, it directly adopted into colonial law English anti-Catholic penal codes. So I hope, as I say, by translating Sir Nathaniel Brent's judgment, I can better understand the ways in which myriad legal frameworks in the early modern Atlantic were deployed to create what Laura Benton has described as multi-centric legal orders. In particular, I want to work more on the importance of Brent having trained as an ecclesiastical lawyer and therefore in Roman and natural law, which Nicholas Canny and David Armitage and Lauren Benton have all argued helped organise European empires and negotiate their coexistence between them and contact between indigenous sovereign nations. But if nothing else, it's really cool that one of the first articulations of this was done by someone trying to get a Catholic off the hook. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was really insightful. And I have to say thank you also for the other shout out for MBIC conference, which is another collaboration that we have with Durham University, the Centre for Catholic Studies, which is British early modern English and Irish Catholicism. I always have to remember what that actually stands for, but yeah, thank you for that shout out. To everybody who is in our audience, if you want to ask Helen some questions, we will be doing our Q&A after our second speaker, but in the meantime, while those questions are in your mind, please put them into the chat box below, and we will come to them when we have a moment. Right, it's my great pleasure to move on to our next speaker for this evening. We have Professor Elizabeth Powell, and Elizabeth is the author of David Jones and the Craft of Theology, Becoming Beauty, and she also teaches a course in Theology and Visual Arts at the London Global Gateway. She is the assistant professor at the Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham University, with whom she is developing the Catholicism, Literature and the Arts research programme. After completing her graduate studies and a few years of teaching at the Faculty of Divinity in Cambridge University, she was the Laureate Fellow in Theology and Spirituality, also with the Centre for Catholic Studies, and her current research interests are in the philosophy and theology of place, and she is working towards a manuscript on the eco-theological vision of David Jones's art and poetry. Tonight, Elizabeth will be exploring the theme of the Poetics of Liturgy and Place in relation to her research on the art and poetry of David Jones, and in anticipation of the upcoming Third International Catholicism, Literature and the Arts Conference, which will be hosted this summer at the London Global Gateway in partnership with the Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham University. So it is my great pleasure to now hand over to Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. It's really lovely to be here, and especially just wanted to say hello to fellow Jones scholars that have come along. So I'll begin by introducing the conference theme, which is Liturgy in Place for the Catholicism, Literature and the Arts conference this summer. I think last summer we had quite a good showing of Jones folks, so it'd be really wonderful to be able to welcome you back again this year. So I'll just start my screen share. Okay. Right, so speaking very clearly in Helen's paper, this question of to be able to answer the question, who am I, will be highly unlikely to be possible without first answering the question, or without meditation on the question of where am I? there's this fundamental place, so to speak, of place in human experience. But reflecting on the meaning and nature of place is certainly more difficult than one might think at first glance. So place seems both ubiquitous and yet remarkably elusive to define. So Tim Cresswell, in his introduction to place, he's writing as a geographer, suggests that place signifies perhaps most basically a meaningful location, and thinks about place as not only a thing in the world, but a way of understanding the world. Place, he writes, is how we make the world meaningful and the way we experience the world. So the centrality of the concept of place to human experience is good reason why it's really flourishing across multiple disciplines. So Cresswell is a geographer, of course, in political theory, philosophical discourse, and so forth. And arising through a lot of these, through many of these discourses, is an understanding of place that's not static, but always processual. So Cresswell again writes of places as never being finished, but always produced through the reiteration of practices. So our conference is really interested in the art's role in creating place, creating, shaping, contesting place, or its role in placemaking, in this process of shaping meaning and practice in material space. Got a quote I was very happy to come across in Edward Casey's A Philosopher of Place, his book Representing Place. This quote from Marcel Proust: "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." In having new eyes. So the centrality really of our engagement with place is the core of artists' work, and of course also liturgical practices. So the conference in Catholicism, Literature and the Arts will be looking especially at the Catholic tradition's contribution to this placemaking through the arts, which of course is very broad ranging. And our speakers will be approaching this or engaging the theme of place in relation to the arts and the Catholic tradition from quite a lot of different directions. So some of these questions that are in the overview there are capturing that and pointing to that. So for instance, Robin Jensen from Notre Dame, Indiana, will be speaking about her Templeton Religion Trust project, in which she's asking how the type of art and where it's placed affects people's experiences of it, and particularly in relation to encountering of sacred art in secular contexts. So this question around what difference the material surroundings in which we encounter religious artworks might make to our reception of them. And also some of these other questions of how the arts create, shape, or contest Catholic, global, regional, and local identities, and how art in the Catholic tradition is attending to the displaced, the homeless, refugees, and to the more than human world. That great phrase of David Abram, who's a nature writer and philosopher of place as well, the more than human. So Valentin Guerlier will be looking at the category of hospitality as a way of thinking about place in relation to the more than human world. And we're very excited to welcome a Canadian sculptor named Timothy Schmaltz, who's made a quite substantial contribution to public and religious sculptures in North America and Europe. And a lot of his work and the different places they're installed are shifts, not just the topography of that place, but the social relations within that. So one example of that is Homeless Jesus sculpture, which is in Farm Street Church, or one of them is in Farm Street Church, where his talk will be held, as well as a musical performance of Olivier Messiaen's quartet for the End of Time. And I'll also be taking us to the National Gallery and working on an itinerary through the gallery on this theme of liturgy and place. So part of the you can see in our overview, this kind of these questions in the center there about how liturgy shapes our understanding of place and how our perception and creation of place might inform or reform the liturgy, are really the heart of some of my own work currently. So in speaking of the liturgy, it's of course liturgical practices and places related to the Mass, but also just more broadly about human experience of the liturgical as a lived relation with God. So place as being not just a being in the world, but a being before God. And liturgy, of course, is not just a thing in the world, but similarly this way of understanding the world. There's much conceptual work, I think, yet to be done here, and how liturgy and place, the categories of liturgy and place might shape and inform one another. And I'll get to that a little bit in my speaking about Jones's work. So as those here who are, I want to say friends of Jones and of his many labors will know, these questions around liturgy, place, their relation, they're almost start to feel synonymous with Jones's work itself. It's these kind of overarching themes of his oeuvre. He himself was Anglo-Welsh, 20th century artist and poet, and ranging across remarkably broad range of art forms, including verse, wood engravings, paintings, inscriptions, and so forth. So Jones will have a place in our conference, fortunately, already. So Rowan Williams will be working really primarily with him. So his paper on fixed place and mobile time, the archaeology of experience, and David Jones and others, which I hope will be a contribution to Jones studies more broadly. And as this is really the category of place as being kind of explicitly addressed in Jones's work as a theoretical concept with which to approach it, is really starting to take off, and work by someone named Rachel Pomeroy and Neil Alexander, the works of some young scholars, one of whom is here, Jasmine Hunter Evans, on looking at Rome, ancient Rome, and his work, another work by Francesca Brooks. All of these show, I think, that Jones not only has this, that place is something that he's continuously working with, but that he really still has a great contribution to make to discourse of place studies more broadly. So hopefully that will develop a bit through conference and through short papers contributions as well. So in turning to, I'm just going to lay out kind of this broad sketches of this proposed manuscript. I definitely say proposed. So I see this as really the beginning of a conversation on what I'm approaching as Jones's eco-theological vision through these categories of liturgy, place, and kinship. So I'm seeking to expand this growing field of eco-theology by demonstrating this contribution of creative theological work that's enacted and performed through literary texts and visual art. So this isn't the first place that theologians go in thinking about the relation of the divine and ecology. The wager is that inhabiting Jones's imagined places in poetry and visual art initiates one into practices of perception and attention that may renew and transfigure one's everyday lived relation to place and places, and that these imagined places are shown to be invaluable resources in response to the global environmental crisis that we all face. So theoretically, and this is something I won't go into much here, but I'm very interested in the potential usefulness of a phenomenologist named Jean-Yves Lacoste for approaching Jones and the dynamics of place within his work. So he suggests, he's really doing a phenomenology of liturgical places. So he looks at figures like the recluse or the perpetual pilgrim, as these figures that seem to subvert and bring out an excess of place, or the logic of place as it's usually thought or lived. So thinks of as either being this, not rather than only being this kind of Heideggerian being in the world or relation to the earth, he's pointing to this prior relation to place as a being before God, and of liturgical places as sites of fragile anticipation. So liturgical practices are always in place, of a place, in sense enfleshed. He's suggesting that the concept of being there, or of a corporeal existence, is simultaneously and essentially tantamount to this being before God. So I'm interested in the way that he's kind of putting liturgy in tension with the logic of place, or topology, as a way that most those really sensitive readings of Jones's visual art and his poetry recognize at first this sense of kind of a tension between what seem like dichotomies between, say, the city and the rural, or London and Wales, or even father and mother, depending on one's approach. And yet there's never any close reading is always attentive to the way that those dichotomies are constantly being transgressed, and never fall into these simple oppositions for Jones. So I'm interested that liturgy, liturgical places, a phenomenology of liturgy, might be a resource, kind of thinking about that dynamic in his work. But it's a wager, and I don't know, so I would be interested to talk to more of you. Right, so that's the approach, the topic. I'm structuring it around 3 theological topoi, or that's the hope. So just beginning with the place of the incarnation as being absolutely kind of foundational for Jones's thinking about place. And it's such an interesting place to begin because of the way it plays immediately with the logic of place. So in this nativity wood engraving, he's quoting this line from Liturgy of the Mass, the Eve of the Assumption, I think, I can't remember exactly where, but so Virgin Mother, he whom the whole world cannot hold was enclosed in thy womb. There's this paradox of enclosure in the incarnation there. And in another work, in his essay, Art in Relation to War, he has this very funny side comment, which I've been keying into for a while and trying to think through more what he means. But he has this comment that perhaps we need to do Cézanne's apples again after Julian of Norwich's little hazelnut, which endureth and ever shall, for God loveth it. So part of my work's been playing out that, or working through part of what, how Julian's hazelnut and her revelations of divine love might be informing and shaping Jones's own vision of place and that. So we can see in this Annunciation painting, his drawing of this apple cradled in Mary's hands, and which can be a looking back to that the Edenic Eve, the Edenic apple. But I'd like to also think that something about Julian's hazelnut might be being drawn in here. And then this icon of Julian, the iconographer has very cleverly placed a hazelnut in between her ring finger and her thumb, which is a liturgical gesture of the humanity and divinity of Christ. So this placing of the hazelnut between this meeting point. Of course, the hazelnut for Julian is this creation, or the thing like a hazelnut, I should say, is all that is made. So this seeing of all things held within this tiny place. So I'm curious, about following through how that might be working its way out in Jones's work. There's a close-up of his, or his Annunciation painting there again. So if the incarnation is really grounding or kind of the source of Jones's understanding or vision of place, the place of the cross is the center and consummation for him, not only of human history, but of the more than human creatures and all earthly places and their evolution through time. So here, just as a transition, there's this Madonna and Child in the landscape. So Jones was painting quite a lot of landscapes of Wales around this time. And Edward Casey writes about the difficulty, of creating landscape paintings as being itself a quandary of containment. So the sense of our experience of a landscape both has this temporal non-simultaneity and a spatial incomprehensible, that it can't be comprehended all in one. So it's this quandary of containment that the artist wrestles with. I think there's more work to be done really with this Madonna and Child in relation to his other landscapes, and the way she's kind of filling the frame there is also echoed in this landscape painting from a few years later of the cross. So for Jones, what I'd like to focus on in this work is the way the cosmic cross for him. So again, the sense of the more than human as always being drawn into his vision of the crucifixion. And this, where'd it go? And this is just a page from his book, The Anathemata, and you can kind of see through some of my circles and notes on the page. He has this repetition of kinds here, playing with that wonderful ambiguity in the Middle English of kind as both being nature and also kindness and kinship as well. So this is a scene of the cross, focusing on sacrifice through figures of birds and the bear and so forth. Again, much to be done there, I think. And in this crucifixion scene, Sanctus Christus de Capellafin, I've just set this next to an excerpt from his poem, The Sleeping Lord, that was written some 40 years after the painting itself. But one really, when drawing together, looking at both the painting and this poem together, there becomes this very strong identification with the Lord's body, with the land itself. Some students of mine just pointed out how in this crucifixion painting, even the rib cage, it looks a bit like a tree itself, which isn't something I'd ever really seen before. But that's very in line with the Sleeping Lord poem, where at one point he speaks of the breaking or the felling of trees through a Latin poem that uses the word fraximus, which is the same word that's used in the Mass for the breaking of the host. So he's suggesting these very strong associations between the land and the Lord, as in this poem. And the third theological topoi, so the place of the resurrection and a transfiguration. So Jones has very, very few images of the resurrection, and these two, as far as I know, and I'd love if someone knows otherwise, are the only ones that I'm really aware of, and they're both part of larger works that were done very early for book illustrations. So the one on the right, this Resurrection of Christ, 1926, is the frontispiece to the Book of Jonah. And the Resurrection from 1924 was a part of the Child's Rosary book. But similar to art traditions in the East, for instance, the resurrection itself isn't represented the same way that it's been represented in came to be represented in the West. So it was really images, especially of the transfiguration itself, that stood in its place. And I think that's suggestive perhaps about how to see some of the work of the place of resurrection as transfiguration in Jones's work. So I'm hoping to explore in particular, if we've kind of gone out to the cosmic, to come back into the domestic places of human dwellings, and the way these perhaps invite us into a way of seeing, into a transfigured vision. That's this recalling and anticipation of the new creation, inaugurated in the resurrection and glimpsed in the transfiguration. So here's one well-known example of this from Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, of Flora and Calyx Light. So these watercolors, akin to this one, are very much characterized by this impression of transparency and of blurring of an inside and an outside, creating, as Paul Hills writes, these kind of magic casements. So through Jones's framing of perspective, through windows, doors, and curtains, he's drawing attention to the mode and place of sight itself, and perhaps gesturing to its promised glorification. So there's, again, much that can be said, and that's always with Jones's work about each one of these images. But one thing I think just I'd love to point out on Flora and Calyx Light that I haven't heard others notice, so it's quite possible that I'm wrong, which is, of course, these beautiful glass vases seem to be recalling the Eucharist, the Eucharistic chalice. And then but along the table, it looks to me like grains of wheat heads that have fallen to the ground. So recalling the scripture passage of, unless grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it cannot be, cannot grow again. So there's definitely something of this kind of sacrifice mixed with this eschatological anticipation and orientation. So that is, in very brief form, what I hope to be working on and going forward, and to begin conversations with my fellow friends and colleagues at Notre Dame and CCS about. So, and we hope to see you at the conference to carry on with that very much so.
Oh, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was amazing. I can't say that I am a Peter scholar, but I really found that absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there are people out there who will have lots of questions. So if you do have questions for Elizabeth or for Helen, please use that chat box at the bottom of the screen and put those in there, and we can put them to them now. Right, I'm going to start off with a question. If that helps, if that's okay. So I'm going to start off with Elizabeth. Helen. Helen, your topic is what I was consider like very multidisciplinary. It jumps from history to Catholic studies to legal studies almost. How did you come to formulating this area and getting to this area and finding your niche?
I kind of essentially realized that a sense of profession in early modern, particularly in the colonies where you had very small populations in the first 100 years, everyone was a jack of all trades and were much more confident with sort of legislative nature of society and so on. And so actually, because of the way the legal system intersected with theology and with civil law and so on, that I just couldn't pull them apart. And I kind of thought, okay, I'm going to have to become a bit of a jack of all trades in myself to be able to understand this society and their mindset. So yeah, a lot of the time it was a case of I don't feel like I'm fully reading every element of what this particular text is doing. So often I'm going back to the same text and actually seeing it evolve in different ways. So particularly for this legal case, the conclusions I'm reaching for lay Catholics are slightly different to priests who then had to put their assets in trust with lay Catholics, because for example, in Maryland particularly, the law of Baltimore, for example, says that the Jesuits cannot own land as a corporation because that would violate praemunire. And so he reaches a compromise with the Catholic Bishop of London to say essentially, not the Bishop of London, sorry, the procurator, to say, well, what we'll do is we'll have them hold it as individual men. And even when that sort of comes under a little bit of scrutiny under Ingles Rebellion, they then start transferring it over to other lay Catholics. So they're very, despite the fact they shouldn't be able to train in law, they seem to be very astute at it. And that's what I want to kind of figure out. What is it how are they managing to gain that expert knowledge? But yeah, it does mean dipping my toe into multiple fields. And it takes a long time to get to grips with it as a result.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helen. And I should clarify, when I said Peter, I meant David Jones. I'm really sorry. It's just like my mental block on the name for one moment. I don't really mean, no offense to anyone. Brain just went to a completely different wrong person. But I was paying attention, Elizabeth, I have to say, even though I got the name wrong. So David Jones, like I said, I'm not a David Jones scholar, but I found it really interesting how you presented some of your research in the manner you did, and how kind of you had the painting and the poetry next to each other. Did he ever do that as an artist? Because I mean, you say he's like prolific in what he was doing and in creative outputs. He seemed incredible in kind of not just focusing in one method, very much looking at the whole spectrum of kind of arts in general. So did he ever kind of write and have his paintings alongside each other, and did they blend into each other, or was it just very much we can see thematics moving between the two?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there was always a dialogue going on between his different art forms for him, and there are some explicit juxtapositions in two of his books of poetry. So in parenthesis, a poem about or growing out of his experience in World War I, and then the Anathemata, which is he writes much later. And in both of those works, well, for in parenthesis, he actually creates drawings for that. And in parenthesis, he brings in works that are called these painted inscriptions. So they're kind of like calligraphy, but in more Roman style lettering, and not into stone, but used paint to do them. So these painted inscriptions that he, as far as we know, didn't explicitly write for that poem, but he poses them or interjects them next to a section of his poetry, like in that example that I showed there. So yeah, I think there was just always this kind of meditating, ruminating, everything is really closely interwoven for him throughout all the different mediums. But his painted inscriptions, which Jasmine's actually done quite a lot of work on, are really interesting in the way they bring together his visual and his verbal artwork, right? So they're working with always texts that have been, they're never his own texts in a way. They're usually from the liturgy, or from a poem or a prayer or a song, these kinds of things. But he's really playing there with the shape of the words on paper, right? So it's those material forms of the letters themselves that are used to communicate their meaning. So.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned Jasmine, because she's just actually put a question in for you. So she said, I find your focus on place with Jones really interesting, both artistically, considering the spaces he creates in his work, and in relation to the natural environment, religious environments. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how his interest in animals fits into Jones' thinking about this.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I mean, it's such a huge question in a way. So I guess the first thing that comes to mind is just that sense of, for Jones to be human being, And to be a maker, to remember ourselves as creators of things, is to remember ourselves as earthly creatures. So in that, we are ourselves animals is something that we tend to forget. But he, very much thinks that's essential to remembering our human dignity, as well as remembering our animal, earthly, corporeal nature. So that connection to the wider animal world is really essential, kind of first, maybe even first and foremost for him. And that, and yeah, I mean, some of his earliest drawings, as you know, from when he was a boy, were of animals. Tiger from the London Zoo that he would go and study. So they definitely have a continuous place, in his oeuvre in that way. And I think that crucifixion scene in the Good Friday section of towards the end of the Anathemata, the role of the animals there, they're not just playing a kind of supporting role, in the sense of, they're telling us, they're just kind of stand-ins for human meaning in a way. It's kind of like, no, these are the actions of an animal. These are natural actions of an animal. What are they telling us? And I think that's like part of the direction I want to draw out in Jones, where when he says, like, I found out the shape of my vocation as an artist by hanging out in the land of Wales. I want to take that really seriously. Like, he says the land spoke to him. Okay, like, let's take that as our starting point instead of, so that's part of that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth. And Helen, you're going to go up to Durham later on this year because they have this wonderful collection of residential research libraries up there. And I'm really interested to know what are you planning to look into while you're up there? What resources are there available for you?
Yeah, so my kind of primary interest is two people. Well, first is Susan Hawley, who founded the Sepulcrans, and I think that she is the kin of a gentleman called Jerome Hawley, who was one of the first kind of legislators and colonizers in Maryland, and his brother Henry Hawley was also the first governor of Barbados. And there are essentially a series. Their role is that under Henry Hawley, the first kind of iteration of slave codes is developed in the colony. At the same time, something similar tries to be passed in Maryland, but it doesn't get through. And so I want to see if through Susan Hawley's correspondence, if they are kin, if there's any indication of their thought process within that, just in the correspondence. But also then thinking about this idea of kin networks and moving around, how colonists in Maryland are potentially trying to support the exiled church back at home or the English mission. So I've got a couple of kind of incidental references to bequests that were made in wills that went back to places like Dowie. There was also a number of colonists who had actually been trained in school, where their schooling was done on the continent. So I want to have a better sense of how all those networks are coming together. The second one is the Baronet of Gibbside, who was essentially he married one of the Calvert women, and as a result of that marriage, land was ceded to him just outside of Southampton. Around about the same time, you start seeing the trade of tobacco coming out of Maryland going primarily through the Salon rather than through London, and then back into the Low Countries. And so what I was trying to figure out was that contract about trying to keep everything in-house and everything within the confessional community from growing it to sort of bypassing English taxes and then going into the continent where the market was bigger. So yeah, there's a few kind of things I'm just trying to uncover, but and there's, especially with the religious collections as well, understanding some of the material culture that went over to Maryland and how it evolved in a colonial context.
Gosh, I could talk to you too all on, but I've just realised what the time is. So we're probably going to have to leave it there this evening. But I want to say thank you to our two speakers this evening for such fascinating topics, and we look forward to hearing more from you two in the future, no doubt. And thank you to everyone in our audience for coming along. It is also an opportunity for me to say special thank you to the Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham University. And as this is our last one for the spring 2022, I want to say special thanks to the team behind the scenes who have been running it all. That is our events and communications team at the London Global Gateway, Tom, Idil and Joe. So thank you so much. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's event and you will consider joining us for future events that we will host in person from now on and virtually as well. So if you're interested in learning more about the Catholicism, Literature and the Arts conference that Elizabeth was talking about earlier, that will take place this summer in London, a link is being posted into the chat box now. As attendees here today, you are among the first to usually receive further details of our forthcoming events, and we hope that one day you'll be able to come and join us in person, or you'll be able to join again one of our virtual events, and please share it around. Please let your friends know we're here. So once again, thank you so much for joining us and have a good evening. Take care.